Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
This time, we're diving into thinking fast and slow.
A classic.
It's become, kind of a Bible for understanding how our minds work,
Absolutely.
especially when it comes to making decisions.
Right.
And we've got all the chapters lined up, ready for some in-depth discussion. We're going to pull out those key takeaways so you walk away, with a solid grasp of Kahneman's work. It's brilliant.
Yeah, it really is.
So are you ready to get started?
Let's do it.
Okay, great. So right off the bat, Kahneman dives into this idea of two systems.
Right.
And these two systems, they kind of drive our thinking often without us realizing it. So let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
In the first chapter, he introduces System 1 and System 2. You walk me through what those are.
Sure. Picture this.
Okay.
System 1 is that instant gut feeling part of your brain.
Okay.
It's the one that just operates effortlessly.
Yeah.
Like knowing that 2 + 2 is 4.
Yeah.
Or recognizing a friend's face.
Got it.
It's fast, it's intuitive, and it's often just running the show
Right.
without us really consciously, thinking about it.
So it's like the autopilot of our minds.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
Now, on the other hand, you have System 2.
Okay,
This is that slower, more deliberate part of thinking.
got it.
It's the one that kind of kicks in when we're solving, really complex problems.
Yeah.
Or when we're making tough decisions.
Okay.
Or trying to resist, that extra slice of cake.
Yeah.
It really requires effort and focus.
Right.
It's almost like a muscle
Yeah.
that kind of gets tired after a workout.
I like that analogy. It's like System 2 is the one hitting the mental gym.
Yeah.
While System 1's just like chilling on the couch.
Exactly.
I like it. But how do these two systems actually interact,
Right.
I'm curious about how this plays out in real life.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the interesting things that Kahneman does is he gives us some real world examples.
Right.
For example, he talks about how our initial impression might be that, say, politicians are more prone to infidelity
Okay.
than people in other professions.
Right.
He even noticed this bias in himself.
Now that you mention it, I've kind of heard that stereotype.
Yeah.
Like, why do we make that association so easily?
Well, it all comes down to what's called the availability heuristic.
Okay.
And basically, this means that our System 1, it tends to jump to conclusions based on what easily comes to mind.
Got it.
And we think about politicians' scandals.
Right.
They often make headlines.
Yeah.
They're all over the news.
They're very public.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So those examples become really readily available in our memory.
Right.
So we end up overestimating the frequency of their indiscretions compared to, say, doctors or lawyers whose private lives are less likely to be splashed all over, the front page.
Right. So it's not necessarily that politicians are more prone to affairs.
Right.
It's just that we hear about it more. And so our brains kind of go, oh, that must be more common.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like judging the safety of air travel,
Right.
based solely on how often plane crashes make the news.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense, right?
It does.
So it really highlights how System 1, while it's super efficient, can sometimes lead us to biased judgments.
Right.
Because it relies on these mental shortcuts
Right.
that aren't always accurate.
Okay. So to summarize chapter 1,
Yeah.
we've got these two systems.
Right.
System 1, fast and intuitive.
Yep.
System 2, the slow, deliberate one.
Mm-hmm.
And we learned that System 1, while often helpful, can lead to biases, like we just discussed,
Yeah.
created by that availability heuristic,
Right.
where we judge things based on how easily we can recall examples.
It's a powerful reminder that we don't always make decisions as rationally as we think we do.
It's a humbling thought, right?
It is.
And that's just the beginning.
Yeah.
In Chapter 2, we delve deeper into the effortful nature of System 2 thinking.
Yeah.
So if System 1's the one that prefers to coast, right?
Right.
I'm guessing System 2 requires a little bit more heavy lifting.
Yeah, it does.
What does Kahneman have to say about that?
Well, he uses these fascinating experiments to illustrate just how much effort System 2 thinking really requires.
Okay.
So one study involved asking people to repeat strings of digits back,
Right.
like 2, 7, 4.
Yeah.
Pretty straightforward, right?
I think I could manage that.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
But in another condition, they had participants add 1 to each digit.
Okay.
So they would hear, say, 2, 7, 4,
Right.
and they'd have to respond with 3, 8, 5.
Okay.
And this seemingly small change, it actually had a big impact.
Yeah, I could see how that would be a little more taxing on the brain.
Exactly.
I had to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here's the fascinating part. The researchers could actually see this effort.
Really?
Yeah, as the task became more demanding, the participants' pupils dilated.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, their heart rates increased.
It was like their brains were working up a sweat.
That's so interesting. So it's not just a feeling.
Yeah.
There's a physiological response.
Exactly.
Wow.
So, it's not just you thinking, oh, this is hard.
Yeah.
Your body's responding.
Right, your body's telling you to stop.
Yeah.
Does this mean we're, destined to be mentally exhausted all the time?
Well, thankfully, no.
Okay, good.
Kahneman contrasts those really mentally taxing tasks with something like, just casual conversation.
Right.
That barely requires any effort at all.
Okay, yeah.
We can just kind of let System 1 run the show
Yeah.
in those situations.
Yeah.
But as soon as we have to, say, compare complex products or solve a math problem or, even write a podcast script,
Oh, yeah.
System 2 has to kick in,
Right.
whether it wants to or not.
So it's like System 2 is our on-call expert.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Right.
It's there when you need it.
It's there when we need it. And that's why we can only focus on so much at once.
Okay, yeah.
System 2 has limited resources.
Okay.
And those resources can get depleted.
Ah, interesting.
We'll talk about that more in the next chapter.
Okay, so to wrap up this chapter,
Yeah.
the key takeaway is that System 2 thinking it's effortful,
Yeah.
and it has those limitations.
You're right. Exactly.
Okay, well, I feel like we've already done some heavy lifting in just these first 2 chapters.
We have.
It's a good reminder to, be mindful of how much we're asking of our brains,
It is.
especially in this, information overload world that we live in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, you mentioned that System 2 can get depleted, and Chapter 3 explores this idea of ego depletion.
Right.
So what exactly does that mean, and why should we care?
So think of ego depletion like willpower fatigue.
Okay.
Imagine you spent all day resisting temptations, making tough decisions, and forcing yourself to, focus on work.
Right.
By the evening, your willpower might be running on fumes.
So it's like that feeling when you've been good all day,
Mm-hmm.
and then you, caze to that late-night craving for ice cream.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Kahneman actually discusses a study where participants had to resist eating delicious cookies
Oh.
and force themselves to eat radishes instead.
Oh, that sounds awful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Later, when they were given a difficult cognitive task, those radish eaters, they gave up much sooner
Really?
than those who had been allowed to indulge in those cookies.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm definitely more prone to, mental meltdowns when I'm trying to be good. So resisting those cookies could actually make me worse at, problem solving later on.
Exactly.
No.
And there's more.
Okay.
Kahneman highlights this classic problem
Okay.
called the bat and ball problem.
Okay.
And it shows how easily our System 2 can be tricked into accepting, a quick but wrong answer from System 1.
Oh, I like these little brain teasers.
Yeah.
Okay, ship me with it.
Okay, so here's the problem. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total.
Okay.
The bat costs $1 more than the ball.
Okay.
How much does the ball cost?
10 cents.
That's what most people say.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
But the correct answer is 5 cents.
Oh, shoot.
Because if the ball cost 10 cents, the bat would cost $1.10.
Right.
And the total would be $1.20.
Ugh, you're right.
Yeah.
My System 1 totally tricked me with that quick, easy answer.
And you know what? Even students at top universities, they often get this wrong.
So that's a little comforting.
Yeah.
I'm not alone in my failings here.
You're in good company.
So what does this bat and ball problem tell us?
Well, it shows how easily we try to avoid cognitive effort, even when it's really important to think things through.
Right, yeah.
We just want that quick and easy answer.
Yeah, definitely guilty of that.
Okay.
Okay, so to summarize Chapter 3, ego depletion is real. Willpower fatigue can impact our decisions.
It can.
And we often overestimate our rationality, opting for that quick and easy answer from System 1, even when it's wrong.
Exactly.
And it can lead to bad decisions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so we definitely need to be aware of that. Now, speaking of how our minds work, Chapter 4 introduces this concept of the associative machine.
Right.
Can you explain what that means?
Sure. Think of your brain as a master storyteller, constantly searching for patterns and connections,
Okay.
trying to create a coherent narrative,
Yeah.
even if it has to fill in the gaps.
Right, so it's like our brains are always trying to make sense of the world,
Exactly.
even if it means jumping to conclusions, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Kahneman uses this great example. Imagine you read a news story about a woman who lost her wallet in New York City.
Okay, yeah.
Now, there could be many reasons for this,
Right.
but Our associative machine might immediately jump to the conclusion that she was a victim of a pickpocket.
Because that's like a common stereotype
Exactly.
associated with big cities like New York.
Exactly. Even though the story never explicitly mentioned a pickpocket.
Right.
Our minds just automatically fill in those gaps.
Yeah.
And they create this really plausible narrative.
It's just like judging a book by its cover.
Right.
Or in this case, judging a city
Yeah.
by its stereotypes.
Exactly.
So we create a story based on the limited information that we have.
Right.
But that story isn't necessarily the whole truth.
Exactly. And this is what Kahneman calls what you see is all there is, or WYSIAD.
WYSIAD. Okay, I love these acronyms.
It's a good one.
So WYSIAD.
Basically, it means that System 1 makes judgments
Okay,
based only on the information that's readily available,
got it.
without considering what might be missing.
And that can have a big impact on our decision-making, right?
Absolutely, because we often don't realize how much we're filling in the gaps.
Right, with assumptions.
Exactly.
Okay, so to summarize Chapter 4,
Yes,
System 1, it's like that associative machine
it is.
constantly linking ideas, creating stories,
Right.
even with limited information.
Yeah.
This can lead to biases, errors in judgment,
Uh-huh.
because we jump to conclusions based on what we know,
Right.
not always considering what we're missing.
It's a powerful force.
WY Society is powerful.
It is.
Okay, this is fascinating.
Yeah.
We're just getting started.
Just getting started.
We have a lot more chapters to dive into.
You do.
And we'll be back after a short break to continue this deep dive.
Sounds good. And it can lead us to, believe things even when the evidence might not be there.
That's kind of scary.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. So we're moving on to Chapter 5.
Yep.
And in Chapter 5, we're exploring how this cognitive ease,
Mm-hmm.
this feeling of fluency and familiarity can influence our judgment
Right.
and make us believe things,
Right.
So if something feels right,
Yeah,
we're more inclined to think it's true.
exactly.
That seems dangerous.
It can be. So Chapter 5 really focuses on how this cognitive ease, this mental fluency, can kind of trick us into believing things that might not actually be true.
Okay.
Our brains love simplicity, they love familiarity,
Makes sense.
and so they kind of reward us with this sense of ease.
Right.
When we encounter information that's really easy to process.
So like if I see a statement repeated over and over again, I might just start to believe it
Exactly.
just because it's familiar.
Exactly.
Go on.
Kahneman talks about how repetition, clear fonts, even rhyming can create this illusion of truth.
Wow.
Our brains, they associate fluency with truth,
Okay.
even when there's really no logical reason to do so.
I'm starting to see how this could be manipulated,
Yeah.
right? Like if I want to convince someone of something, I just have to make it sound really simple.
Well, it's not quite that simple, but
Yeah.
there's definitely some truth to that. Advertisers, propagandists, they use these techniques all the time
Right.
to make their messages more persuasive. Sneaky. Can you give me another example
Sure.
of how this cognitive ease can influence our judgments?
Kahneman talks about a study where participants were presented with a list of names,
Okay.
and some names were repeated multiple times,
Right.
while others appeared only once.
Okay.
And then later, they were asked to judge whether each name belonged to a famous person.
Okay.
What they found was that participants were more likely to say yes to the names that they had seen repeatedly,
Wow.
even if those names were completely made up.
So just by being exposed to something multiple times,
Right?
we start to feel like we know it.
Yeah,
And that familiarity can create a sense of truth.
exactly.
It's like that mere exposure effect, right?
Yeah,
We tend to like things more just because we've been exposed to them over and over again.
exactly. It's a really powerful phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how much our kind of subconscious minds are shaping our perceptions
Right.
and judgments.
Right.
So to recap Chapter 5, cognitive ease, that feeling of mental fluency, it can make us more likely to believe things,
Okay.
even if they aren't actually true. Repetition, simplicity, familiarity, all contribute to this,
Yeah.
to this illusion of truth.
Right.
So it's another reminder that our brains love shortcuts.
They do.
And sometimes those shortcuts lead to, conclusions that aren't quite right.
Exactly.
Okay, well, this whole concept of cognitive ease,
Yeah.
it makes me think about how we perceive the world around us,
Yeah.
you know?
Right.
Like what we think is real and what we think isn't real. I'm ready to delve into Chapter 6.
Okay, yeah, Chapter 6 is a good one. It explores how our brains are really wired to seek patterns
Okay?
and explanations,
Okay.
even in random events.
So we're constantly trying to make sense of the world,
We are.
even when there's no inherent meaning there.
Exactly.
I'm sensing a theme here.
You're picking up on it.
Okay, good.
So, Chapter 6 really dives into this inherent need to find order and causality in the world.
Okay.
Even when events are really just random or coincidental, System 1, it's constantly seeking those patterns, those explanations, trying to connect the dots,
Yeah.
create a coherent narrative.
So are we all just like conspiracy theorists then?
Well, not exactly,
Okay.
but there are some similarities.
Yeah.
Kahneman uses this example of basketball players
Okay.
and like hot streaks
Right.
to illustrate this tendency.
Okay.
So we often attribute, streaks of good performance
Right.
to skill or talent,
Okay.
even when those streaks are statistically likely to occur just due to random chance.
Right, totally. Like if a player makes a few shots in a row, you think, oh, they're in the zone.
Yeah.
They're going to make the next one.
Right.
But statistically, it should regress to the mean.
Exactly.
Right.
Our brains just love to find those patterns
Right.
and assign causes, even when it's not warranted.
So System 1, a little bit of a drama queen.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Always looking for a story to tell.
Yeah.
Even if it has to, like, embellish the facts a bit.
Exactly. And this desire for causal explanations, it can sometimes lead to what's called the illusion of control.
Oh, interesting.
This is this belief that we have more influence over events than we actually do.
Oh, yeah. I've definitely fallen for that one before.
Yeah, me too.
Like thinking that if I just wear my lucky socks, my team's going to win.
Exactly. So it's a comforting illusion,
Yeah.
but it can be dangerous if we start basing important decisions on it.
Okay, so to summarize Chapter 6,
Yeah,
our brains are hardwired
they are.
to look for patterns, to look for causes, even when things are random
Right,
or coincidental.
exactly.
This can lead to the illusion of control
It can.
and other biases, especially when we overestimate the significance of small samples
Right.
or streaks.
Or streaks.
Right. Sometimes the simplest explanation
Uh-huh.
is that it was just random chance.
Exactly.
But our System 1 doesn't always like that answer.
It doesn't. It wants a story.
Okay. Well, speaking of jumping to conclusions, Chapter 7 revisits WYSID.
Yeah.
What you see is all there is,
A classic.
and explores its implications
Right.
for judgment and decision-making.
Right. So we're back to that idea that our System 1 makes judgments based on the available information
Right,
without always considering what might be missing.
right.
And it's a great example of how this cognitive bias can lead to, all sorts of errors in judgment.
Okay,
Remember, System 1 is all about efficiency,
right,
and it really loves to create these quick and easy explanations
right. Those shortcuts.
based on the information that's right there in front of it.
Yeah. So it's like our brains are constantly going, okay, I have enough information, I'm going to go with it.
Exactly, exactly. And this can be really problematic because, as we've seen, the information we have is often incomplete
Right.
or even biased.
Yeah.
Kahneman gives us this great example of, imagine you're evaluating a statement and someone tells you, I read in the New York Times that,
Yeah.
versus I heard at the water cooler that.
Right. Huge difference.
Right, yeah. And so you're much more likely to believe the statement attributed to, a source like the New York Times.
Right. Because you perceive it to be more reliable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that our System 1, it often doesn't distinguish degrees of belief.
Okay.
It's more like a binary system.
Right.
You either believe something or you don't.
Okay.
And this can lead to problems when we're dealing with information that has varying levels of certainty.
Right. So even though I might have some doubts about what I heard at the water cooler,
Right.
my System 1 might just lump it in
Yeah,
with what I read in the New York Times.
exactly. As things I believe.
Right. Things I believe.
And
Yeah.
this is how misinformation and rumors can spread.
Right.
Our brains are wired to accept these coherent narratives,
Right.
even if they're based on, kind of flimsy evidence.
Right.
WYSID. It's a powerful force.
This is a dangerous one
It can be. It can be.
because our brains are constantly filling in those gaps with assumptions.
Right.
And those assumptions are not always accurate.
Exactly. And, it's compounded by the fact that we often don't even realize we're doing it.
Right.
Our system, too, that lazy controller, it's not always engaged enough
Right.
to question those judgments from System 1.
So, to summarize Chapter 7,
Mm-hmm.
WYSID, can lead us to jump to conclusions based on limited info.
Yeah.
We don't always distinguish degrees of belief.
Right.
And that tendency to create a narrative,
Uh,
it can make us really susceptible
it can.
to misinformation and biases.
Exactly.
So another reminder to be critical of the information that we encounter
Right.
and question those assumptions.
Yeah, it's good to be skeptical.
Yeah,
Question those assumptions.
absolutely.
Question everything.
Okay. Well, this all makes me think about the mental processes behind these judgments.
Right. Like, how are we actually coming to these conclusions?
Right. Yeah.
And that's what we get to explore in Chapter 8.
Yeah, exactly. Chapter 8 really delves into those mental processes
Okay.
behind those quick evaluations and assessments that our System 1 is constantly generating.
So we're going even deeper into the inner workings of our brains.
We are.
This is getting really meta.
It is.
So, Chapter 8, the mechanics of judgment.
Yeah.
How does it work?
So our System 1, it's continuously monitoring both our internal and external environments,
Okay.
making these assessments, evaluations without any conscious effort on our part.
So we're not even aware of it.
We're not.
It's just happening.
It's happening in the background all the time.
Wow.
It's like our brains are constantly running a background check on everything.
Okay, so we're not even aware of most of these judgments being made.
We're not.
Okay.
Kahneman argues that, System 1 is constantly making these basic assessments,
Okay.
like judging distances,
Okay.
recognizing faces.
Yeah. Detecting emotions and voices.
Right, yeah.
And these judgments are automatic.
Okay.
They're effortless.
Right.
And they really provide that foundation for our intuitions and gut feelings.
Okay, so that makes sense for those basic judgments.
Yeah.
But how does this translate into more complex judgments?
Right.
Like, deciding whether to trust someone
Right.
or whether to invest in a stock.
Right. Well, here's where things get interesting.
Okay.
Kahneman argues that our System 1 often substitutes easier questions for more difficult ones.
Okay.
It's all about that cognitive ease
Right.
and efficiency.
So instead of trying to answer the question, is this person trustworthy?
Yeah.
My brain just goes, do I like this person?
Exactly.
That's easier.
It is.
And that can lead to all sorts of biases.
Yeah, because liking someone isn't always a good indicator of trustworthiness.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, no, totally. We make decisions based on gut feelings.
Uh-huh.
And those gut feelings are often shaped by factors
Right.
that aren't relevant
Exactly.
to the decision at hand.
Exactly.
Okay, so what else is going on in Chapter 8?
Well, he introduces this other really interesting concept called intensity matching.
Intensity matching.
Okay? And basically, this is how our brains translate values across different dimensions.
Okay.
So, for example, he uses the example of asking someone, if Sam were as tall as he is intelligent, how tall would he be?
That's a weird question.
Yeah, it is. But our brains actually do this all the time.
Really?
Yeah, often without us even realizing it. So, for example, we might judge someone's generosity based on, how warmly they smile.
Right.
Or their competence based on how confidently they speak.
Right, so we're making these weird connections in our brains all the time.
We're constantly making these cross-dimensional translations.
Okay.
And they can definitely lead to biases.
So it's like my brain is a lot more creative
Yeah.
than I give it credit for.
Yeah, it really is. It's constantly making these leaps and connections, often without our conscious awareness.
Okay. Well, is there anything else we need to cover from Chapter 8?
Yeah, there's one more really key concept that I think we need to touch on. The mental shotgun.
Mental shotgun.
Yeah.
That sounds intense.
It is a little bit intense. Basically, it means that our intentions to answer one question can trigger other computations
Okay.
and influence our judgments
Got it.
in unexpected ways.
So it's like I ask my brain for directions to the library.
Yeah,
And it gives me a whole itinerary for a day trip,
I love that analogy.
including lunch recommendations,
Mhm.
historical landmarks,
Yeah,
the whole thing.
it's like, here's everything you could possibly need to know.
Right. And sometimes those extra thoughts, computations, they're helpful,
Yeah.
but other times, not so much.
They can lead us astray.
Okay, so to summarize Chapter 8, System 1 is constantly making judgments, assessments,
Uh-huh.
often without our conscious awareness.
Right.
It likes to substitute easier questions for harder ones,
Yes.
translates values across different dimensions,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes it just fires off this mental shotgun blast
It does.
of thoughts and associations.
It's a lot to keep track of.
It is. It is a lot going on up there. Okay, so in Chapter 9, we see how this tendency to answer easier questions,
Yeah.
it can lead to all these biases in our judgments
Right.
and decisions.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so
Yeah.
Chapter 9, heuristics and biases.
Yeah.
Here we go.
So Chapter 9 really delves into this idea that we often rely on mental shortcuts to answer questions.
Right, because thinking is hard.
Thinking is hard,
Right.
especially when the questions are complex
Right.
or require a lot of effort.
Yeah.
Our brains are like, okay, that question's too hard. Let me find an easier one to answer.
Right, yeah.
And sometimes those shortcuts lead to accurate judgments,
Right.
but other times they can lead to systematic biases. Kahneman uses this example of, imagine trying to predict a political candidate's success
Okay.
based on their appearance or speaking style.
Oh, yeah. Guilty of that.
Yeah.
Like, if someone seems charismatic
Right.
and confident,
Yeah.
I might think, oh, they'd be a good leader,
Yeah.
even if I know nothing about their policies or experience.
Exactly. Our system one just loves to make those quick judgments
Yeah.
based on these superficial cues.
Right.
And those cues can be very misleading.
Yeah, because I might be substituting the easier question, does this person seem likable,
Right.
for the harder question of, are they qualified for this job?
Exactly.
Okay, so it's helpful and harmful.
It is.
Right.
Yeah, it's a double-edged
It
sword.
allows us to make quick decisions, but can also lead to those flawed judgments.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm.
And especially dangerous when we're not aware of it, right?
Exactly. Exactly. We might assume we're being rational, we're being objective,
Right.
when in reality, our system one is kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes.
So to recap Chapter 9, we often answer easier questions instead of the harder ones.
Right.
We rely on those mental shortcuts.
Yep.
We substitute superficial cues for more complex analysis.
Right.
And this can lead to biases in our judgments and decisions,
That can.
especially when we're not aware of our own cognitive shortcuts.
Exactly.
It's another reminder to be more mindful
It is.
of those thought processes.
Right.
Question our assumptions.
Yeah, question everything.
Okay, so Chapter 10, we're exploring the law of small numbers.
Yes.
And this is basically how our intuition often leads us to believe in patterns and trends
Right.
based on limited evidence.
Right.
So we're talking about jumping to conclusions
We are.
based on not enough data.
Exactly.
I'm sensing that System 1 loves a good shortcut,
It does.
even if it leads to a dead end.
Even if it does.
Okay. So Chapter 10, the seductive power of small samples.
Yeah, we really crave patterns and certainty. So our system one often jumps to conclusions
Okay.
based on really limited evidence,
Right.
even when those conclusions are statistically unwarranted.
So like if I flip a coin 5 times
Yeah.
and it lands on heads every time,
Uh-huh.
I might think, oh, this coin is biased,
Right.
even though it's totally possible to get 5 heads in a row just by chance.
Exactly.
Right.
Our intuition often leads us astray when we're dealing with small samples.
Okay.
Kahneman calls this the law of small numbers.
Law of small numbers.
Okay.
Okay, so we believe that small samples are representative of the larger population,
Or you do.
even when they're not.
Even when they're not.
Okay, how can this play out in real life?
Well, Kahneman gives an example of the Gates Foundation
Okay.
and their investment in small schools.
Right?
So they invested in small schools based on the finding that smaller schools, on average, had better academic outcomes.
Okay.
However, this conclusion was based on very limited data.
Right.
And when larger samples were considered, the effect disappeared.
So even well-intentioned initiatives can be based on these flawed assumptions.
They can.
Wow.
And this happens all the time. We see this in, news stories about, some new study
Right.
claiming that, eating blueberries prevents cancer
Right.
based on, a small sample of participants.
Okay, yeah.
And our system one might jump to the conclusion that, oh, this is a proven fact.
Right.
When in reality, much more research is needed.
It's very seductive, right? The law of small numbers.
It is.
We want to find those patterns.
We do.
We want to believe that we understand how things work.
Yeah, we want that certainty.
Yeah. So to sum up Chapter 10,
Yeah.
our intuition often leads us to believe in this law of small numbers.
Right.
We overestimate the significance of those small samples.
Uh-huh.
And we jump to conclusions based on that limited evidence.
Exactly.
It can lead to those biases
Yep.
when we neglect base rates and focus on anecdotal evidence.
Right.
Okay.
It's a good reminder to be skeptical of claims based on small samples.
And to always consider that big picture.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, Chapter 11 focuses on this thing called the anchoring effect.
Yeah.
And I'm already intrigued by the name.
It's a good one.
So what is this anchoring effect?
Well, imagine I ask you to guess the population of Chicago.
Okay.
But before you answer, I casually mentioned the number 10 million.
Okay.
Even though that number has absolutely nothing to do with Chicago's actual population,
Right.
your estimate is likely to be closer to 10 million than it would have been otherwise.
Really? Just hearing a number
Yeah,
can influence my judgment,
it can.
even if it has nothing to do with the actual question.
It's a powerful effect.
That sounds wild.
It is pretty wild.
Yeah.
So Chapter 11 really delves into this anchoring effect.
Okay.
It's one of the most powerful and pervasive cognitive biases that influence our judgments.
Wow.
And it basically means that, when we're asked to estimate something, our brains tend to latch on to that first number we hear, even if that number is completely arbitrary.
So even random numbers can act as anchors.
They can.
Okay. How is that even possible?
Well, Kahneman suggests that anchoring works in two ways. First, there's a priming effect.
Okay.
So that anchor, it primes our minds to think about numbers that are similar to it.
Right.
So if you mention 10 million, my brain starts thinking about numbers in the millions, even if those numbers aren't relevant to the question at hand.
So the anchor sets a kind of mental framework
Exactly, yeah.
for our estimates.
Yeah, it's like a starting point.
Okay.
And then second, there's an adjustment process.
Okay.
So we start with that anchor,
Right.
and then we try to adjust our estimate away from it.
Okay.
But often we don't adjust enough,
Okay.
and our final estimate ends up being biased towards that anchor.
So like our brains are lazy, right?
Yeah, they are. They'd rather just stick close to the anchor than make a big effort to adjust.
Right. We love those shortcuts,
We do.
even when they're not accurate. Okay.
And it's really interesting.
What?
The anchoring effect has been shown to influence judgments in all sorts of real-world situations.
Right.
Negotiating salaries, setting prices, making investment decisions.
Give me an example.
Sure. So, Kahneman describes a study where real estate agents were asked to estimate the value of a house.
Okay. Yeah.
And some agents were given a high asking price as an anchor,
Okay.
while others were given a low asking price.
Okay.
And the results were striking. The agents who saw that high anchor, they gave significantly higher estimates,
Wow.
even though they claimed that the asking price didn't influence their judgment.
So even professionals,
Yeah.
people who are experts in their field,
Right.
they can be swayed by these anchoring effects.
They can.
Wow.
It just shows you how powerful these cognitive biases can be.
Yeah.
They're operating below our conscious awareness.
Right.
And they can influence our judgments in these really subtle but profound ways.
Okay. To recap Chapter 11, the anchoring effect, it's a cognitive bias.
It is.
It causes us to be influenced by irrelevant numbers
Right.
when we're making estimates.
Exactly.
Even random numbers can act as anchors.
It can.
Wow.
And it can influence a wide range of decisions.
Right.
From setting prices to negotiating salaries, making investments.
It's a reminder to be aware of this
It is.
and to be more critical
Yeah,
of the information we encounter.
absolutely.
Okay. Well, speaking of mental shortcuts, in Chapter 12, we're going to explore another one, the availability heuristic.
Yeah.
And this is how we judge the frequency or likelihood of events
Right.
based on how easily we can recall examples.
Exactly.
So if I can easily think of examples of something, I'm more likely to think it's common or likely to happen.
You got it.
Okay. Start to see a pattern here.
Yeah.
Our brains love those shortcuts.
They do. They love those shortcuts.
So, Chapter 12, the availability heuristic.
Yeah. So Chapter 12 really dives into this availability heuristic, which is another powerful mental. It can lead us to overestimate the likelihood of those rare events, especially if they're vivid or emotionally charged.
Right, because if I can easily imagine it, it feels more real,
Exactly.
even if it's not likely,
Exactly.
statistically.
And this can lead to, some irrational fears and anxieties.
Right.
Kahneman uses the example of terrorism
Okay.
and how, the fear of terrorism, even though it's statistically a very rare event, can have a huge impact on our decisions and our behavior.
Right.
We might avoid certain places or activities because of this fear, even though the actual risk is very small.
So to summarize Chapter 30,
Yeah,
our perception of rare events is often distorted.
it is.
Right.
Yeah.
We might overestimate the likelihood of those vivid, emotionally charged events, even if they're statistically rare.
Exactly.
It's a reminder to, be mindful of those biases
Yeah.
and to really try to assess risks rationally.
Right. Use that system too.
Right. Use that system too. Okay, so we're getting towards the end of our deep dives here.
We are.
Chapter 31 talks about risk policies. What does that mean?
So, Chapter 31 introduces this idea of developing risk policies as a way to make more consistent and rational decisions
Okay.
when we're faced with these repeated gambles or risky choices.
So like having a plan.
Exactly. So instead of just reacting to each situation as it comes up,
Right.
we can develop these broader guidelines
Okay.
to help us navigate these choices.
So instead of just like going with my gut every time,
Right.
I have like a framework for how I'm going to approach these decisions.
Exactly. And this helps us to avoid, the emotional swings,
Right.
the inconsistencies that come from, kind of narrow framing.
So it's like thinking long term
Exactly.
instead of short term.
Think about the big picture.
Right.
Consider the long-term consequences of our choices.
Okay, that makes sense.
Kahneman gives an example of, a CEO who encourages his division managers to take risks.
Okay.
But he also provides them with this clear framework for evaluating those risks and making sure they're aligned with the company's overall goals.
So it's like empowering them to take risks,
Yeah,
but also making sure that they're not just being reckless.
exactly. Exactly. It's about finding that balance
Okay.
between encouraging innovation,
Right.
but also mitigating those potential downsides.
Okay, so to recap, Chapter 31.
Yeah.
Risk policies are all about making consistent and rational decisions,
Uh-huh.
especially when we're faced with those risky choices.
Right.
And it's about thinking long term,
Yes.
having a plan.
Having a plan.
So you're not just reacting emotionally
Exactly.
to every situation.
Yeah, it's about having that strategy.
Okay. Well, we've only got 2 chapters left.
2 more.
Chapter 32 talks about keeping score.
Yeah. And it's all about how we tend to categorize our spending and saving in our minds.
So this is like mental accounting?
Exactly, mental accounting.
Okay, so we create these separate accounts in our heads
Right.
for different categories of spending.
We do. We have our fun money account, our bills account, our savings account.
Right.
And even though it's all just money in the end,
Right.
the way we categorize it can really influence our decisions.
Okay, so how can this lead to like irrational decisions?
Well, Kahneman gives this example of the disposition effect.
Okay.
This is where investors are reluctant to sell losing stocks.
Okay.
Even though it might make financial sense to cut their losses and move on,
Right.
they hold on to those losing stocks because they're kind of fixated on that original price that they paid.
So it's like they're trying to avoid the pain of admitting that they made a bad decision,
Exactly. They're trying to avoid that feeling of loss.
even if it means losing more money in the long run.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting.
And mental accounting can also lead us to, spend money differently depending on where we think it came from.
Okay, so like if I find $20 on the street, I'm more likely to spend it on something frivolous than
Exactly.
if I earn that $20 by working.
It's like it's free money.
Right. Yeah.
So we feel like we can spend it more freely.
Okay. So to recap Chapter 32,
Yeah.
mental accounting
Right.
is how we create those separate mental accounts for different categories of spending
Uh-huh.
and saving.
Right.
This can lead to those irrational
It
decisions,
can.
like holding on to losing investments
Right.
or failing to save for retirement.
Or spending money differently depending on its source.
It's a reminder to, be aware of these mental categories
Yeah.
and how they might be influencing our decisions.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, we're on to our final chapter,
Last one.
Chapter 33, and it's called reversals.
Reversals.
What does that mean?
So Chapter 33 explores this idea that our judgments and preferences can actually be reversed,
Okay.
depending on the context in which they're made.
So what I think is a good decision in one situation might seem like a bad decision in another situation.
Exactly. Our evaluations can be influenced by things like framing,
Right.
comparison, the availability of information.
So it's like that saying, it's all relative, right?
It is. It
Yeah.
is. Kahneman gives this example of, imagine you're judging a legal case
Okay.
and you're asked to decide on the amount of compensation that should be awarded.
Okay.
You might judge the case differently depending on whether you're focusing on the severity of the harm that was caused
Right.
or the intent of the person who caused the harm.
Right.
So if you're focused on the harm, you might award a higher amount of compensation.
Right.
But if you're focused on the intent, you might award a lower amount.
Okay. So even though it's the same case, the way it's framed can influence my judgment.
Exactly.
Okay. So to recap this final chapter, Chapter 33,
Yeah,
our preferences can be reversed depending on the context.
they can.
Framing, comparisons, information availability, they can all influence our evaluation.
I can.
And it's a reminder that, our judgments are not always as objective as we think they are.
They're not.
We're influenced by all sorts of factors.
We are.
Often without even realizing.
Exactly.
Well, that was quite a journey.
It was.
We've covered a lot of ground in thinking fast and slow. From those two systems of thinking to heuristics, biases, all those fascinating mental shortcuts that our brains love to take. It's been eye-opening. It really makes you think about how our minds work and how those mental processes shape our decisions, our judgments, our perceptions of the world. It's a lot to process, but it's incredibly valuable knowledge. It can help us to be more aware of those potential pitfalls, to make better decisions, and ultimately to understand ourselves a little bit better. So if you're looking for a fascinating and insightful read, I highly recommend Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a classic for a reason.
I second that. It's a must-read.
Absolutely. Well, that's it for our deep dive into Thinking Fast and Slow. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll be back next time with another fascinating deep dive.
Until then.